For the most updated version of the Glyphs RPG blueprint, tokens, accessories and resources, please visit www.glyphsrpg.com. Also visit 2ddice.com for our internationally popular D20 RPG coins and our other masterful coin works.
Hi, this is C.W. Smith again, and today we're going to be going into Chapter 5 of the Blueprint, which talks about armor. So, in addition to fate and your standard defensive maneuvers, oftentimes you're going to find that armor is your very last line of defense against certain death and maiming. So, let's go into detail here of what exactly constitutes armor coverage. So, basically, it's just a form-fitting layer of protection against certain attacks and even environmental hazards, and it's basically going to save your character's life quite a bit if they fail a defensive technique or maneuver and whatnot. So, in Glyphs, we look at armor into layers of bodily coverage. First, you have your upper and lower torso for the body itself. Then you have your helmets, your face masks, and stuff like that. Then you have your guards, which are bracers, pauldrons, gauntlets, greaves, sabatons, and anything that covers an arm or an extremity. And finally, boost blocking potential and offer, an additional layer of coverage. So very handy item there. Now, as with weapons, okay, the players and architects alike create their armor section based on a set of defaults, which you can modify as you see fit based on your game. Okay, but there are some things to consider when you do so that I want you to look at. So, besides bodily coverage, we categorize armor by 5 basic metrics, okay, which are very important. So first we have R, which is resilience value. Then we have AHP, which are armor hit points. Then we have SV, which is shock value. Those are the 3 most important ones that you're going to see. Now, additional to that, you have the option of covering resistances. So if an armor is resistant to a certain type of force, that's fine. And any strength restrictions, which are optional in my mind. If you want to impose certain restrictions on what kind of armor a character can wear, we'll go into that here shortly. That's kind of a general summary on armor. Now I want to talk about the specific metrics themselves, so we have a better understanding. So on page 93 of the armor chapter, the first metric that we're going to talk about is R, which is resilience value, which basically means how tough a piece of armor is before it can even be damaged. So that's very important to know. I believe it reflects a little bit more realism. Okay, so how much damage, how much abuse can a piece of armor take before it's actually damaged and therefore suffering from AHP or hit point loss? Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Now, in combat, there are 2 main factors to consider when dealing with armor. First is the weapon or attack itself. How strong is that attack? Okay, and second is the intensity of the attack itself that combines to create damage. So in other words, your character can be attacking the enemy with, a longsword or whatever, and yeah, that's a pretty nice weapon and it can do some pretty nice damage, but if the attack itself from the actual attacker isn't strong enough, it may not necessarily damage the armor. So that's what we're reflecting here with the R value. So what do I mean by that? Okay, now as we get into the damage system, and I've talked about this briefly with a token, damage is determined by spending the token and reading the element glyph to combine with a number of damage, which represents an intensity level. So let's say that I'm spending my token and the results are come out to 2 with the element glyphs. Okay, so that's an intensity 2 attack. If they come out to 3, that's your intensity 3, or basically your critical hit, I guess you could say. A lot of people like to use that term. That's fine. Intensity 1 is exactly what it means. A low level attack. And of course, the excuse me, I'm losing my voice today, a little dry throat. But anyways, a level 0 attack would be your superficial damage. So Here, when we talk about resilience, we want to look at the types of weapons that the section of armor can withstand. Okay, so we have SM, which is small, MD middle, so middle weapons. LG is long arms, okay, larger weapons. GT is great, so your great arms, and finally, okay, our siege arms, which are SG. Okay, so what are we doing here? So R, you'll notice you have several sets of R value. You have 5 different ranges here, which are represented by the types of weapons that we're attacking with, and each of them has 3 subcategories here. So intensity 1, intensity 2, intensity 3. So SM1, for an example, means the armor section could only be damaged by a small weapon with an intensity 1, so pretty weak piece, okay? Whereas an MD2 means that the section can only be damaged by a middle weapon and an attack level of intensity 2. So if you strike with a middle weapon and the intensity is 1, it's not going to damage that piece of armor. So that's what we're reflecting here with resilience value. Next we have AHP, or simply armor hit points, just another way of saying hit points for armor sections. So all that means is it represents the level of damage that an armor can withstand before it's destroyed and completely useless to the defender. Okay, now there are certain numerical values that are assigned by default to each type of material, which we'll get into here in a second. So that's what controls the AHP. Now, AHP is assigned to a bodily section of armor. So one piece of armor can have one set of AHP, and if a character has a different set on a different bodily part, that's a different section with its own set of AHP. So kind of like our damage system, everything is by bodily section. Same applies here to armor. Now, you may have situations to where your armor has a certain resistance against a certain force. Just make sure, especially as a GM, that you clearly define what that is. So common resistances can include fire, radiation, chemicals, electricity, and even certain magical powers, if you will. Now, once an armor's AHP is depleted to 0, it's completely ineffective, and the character in that bodily section becomes vulnerable to attack. Now, in order to repair the armor, then obviously you need to go to a blacksmith or an engineer, or somebody who has the skills and tools and material to repair that armor. Basically, the 2 things you want to consider. The material. Okay, generally you want to use the same material to repair it with that it's made of, and that'll give it the same HP value that it's worth. If you're just patching it up with a makeshift material or something, you're just improvising and it's not the right material, then it assumes that section that's damaged assumes the HP value of the new patchwork, if you will. The third armor metric that we're going to talk about now is shock value, or simply SV. So most armor has the ability to muffle the natural blunt force trauma, or shock value, I guess you could say, inflicted by that have striking or bursting properties. So any blunt type of attack that inflicts those types of properties is generally muffled by the wearer's armor based on its SV ranking. Okay, so that's essentially done to help instill a sense of realism in on the wearer's part, because basically, even though you may have a very nice piece of, let's say, iron armor, depending on the configuration, it may not necessarily be able to withstand or to protect your body from a heavy blunt strike. So that's what that represents. So, all throughout history, you look out, through different types of weapons that were made. They were designed a lot of times to circumvent the protective qualities in armor just by delivering brute force to the target's body. So if you look at history, that's often the case, or even modern times. I mean, just put on a bulletproof vest, and if you were to get shot with the the right caliber round at the right spot, then chances are you're going to feel it, even though that round doesn't necessarily penetrate the vest. So I'm saying that to basically try to instill a sense of more realism with shock value. So that's what we're representing here. So the reason is I want to instill a little bit more strategy when you're using armor. So keep that in mind. So on the flip side, when you're up against an enemy who's heavily armored, then you and your teammates have to work together to try to circumvent the armor. And one way to do that is by using a blunt weapon, or possibly finding a weakness in the armor. So just something to consider here as we look at SV. So how is SV ranked exactly? Okay, so here you'll notice we have 5 different levels, SV0 through SV4. So basically those represent the different levels that damage is muffled based on its strength and its configuration. So an SV rank of 0 simply means that the full striking or bursting damage is sustained by the defender from the attack. So in that case, the piece of armor against a blunt or a bursting type weapon is completely useless, no matter how much hit points it has. Okay. So with an SV of 1, the defender sustains 1/2 of the blunt or bursting damage it normally would. SV2, the defender sustains 1/3 of the striking or bursting force it normally would. And then SV3, you have the defender sustains 1/4. Each rank here gradually muffles a little bit better to finally you get to SV4, which is your heaviest, most intense kind of armor you may see in Warhammer or some type of mech setting. You may see armor like that, which has the very highest SV ranking. Okay, and that completely muffles out any striking or bursting forces done to the wearer's body. So just different ways of looking at armor from that standpoint. So keep that in mind as you create or you purchase different types of armor. So it may or may not necessarily be always a matter of how many hit points the armor can take, but how effective it is against certain types of damage that you want to consider. As we talk about SV, the way SV works is basically configured into different grades of armor, similar to weapons and their effectiveness. Same type of thing applies to armor grades, and an SV value is applied to different types of grades. So we have light armor with an SV of 0, medium armor with an SV of 1, full armor, which is your more complete, your banded mails and so forth. That's an SV of 2, reinforced armor, which you start getting into plated configurations, which is SV3. And finally, fortified armor, it was again the heaviest type, the rarest type in my opinion, is an SV of 4. So if you'll note here, you've got the different grades here, and on to the right here you see several recommended configurations that you'll see in different types of role-playing games. Now these are not the only configurations, but these are just examples to give you an idea of how SV applies to armor configurations. So SV0, you've got, ring or studded type armor, the lightest kind of armors, or plain hide armor if you want. An SV of 1 would be your chain or scaled mail configuration. SV2 would be banded or splint. And then you get into your plated configurations. Now, why is that important? Well, that gives you an idea as to how to visualize it when you're creating it and assigning values, but also there's another reason. If you look to the very right here, there are optional difficulty levels that you can apply if you want to make this even more realistic. That's entirely up to you and how you want to run your campaign. So basically, there are a few restrictions that you could use, and this is one of them. So let's say that you want your character to maybe have some sort of penalty for wearing heavier armor or more bulky armor. Then that can affect how they execute a skill challenge, let's just say. So in other words, here you have different additional difficulty levels that need to be overcome if you're doing a skill set type challenge, if you're wearing heavier types of armor. So as an example, if my character is wearing full armor, has an SV of 2, so banded or splint type armor, then if they're executing a skill that requires certain freedom of movement, then you could have the option of adding an additional 2 difficulty levels to that challenge just by the armor they're wearing. So that's one thing you could do if you chose to. Now, the second type of penalty that you can consider, personally, I don't like penalties too much, especially when it comes to armor, but I do like to have the options open for people to use. Now, in my system, I don't really penalize wearers for their speed scores like other games might. Instead, I simply consider the potential strength requirements used to wear armor. So if you want to apply that, that's fine. If you don't want to go by that, then that works for you too. You know, depending on how your players are and what kind of freedom you want to give them and whatnot. But basically, you could instill a minimum strength requirement to wear a certain kind of armor, and that is explained in the armor materials section. So that basically gives something players to work for when they're assigning attributes to their when they're creating their characters. Is, you know, how do they want to be armored up, and so that's something you might want to consider too. Okay, so now let's kind of put this all together real quick. So those are just some restriction ideas, but SV is the most important part when we're talking blunt damage, especially blunt or bursting. So as an example, why is this important? Okay, so let's suppose for a second that my character is wearing an iron helmet. Okay, pretty solid pleats, right? But let's say the iron helmet has an SV of 1. Okay, so it's a lighter piece. Okay, so the SV1 means it sustains half damage it normally would. So in terms of blunt or bursting forces. So let's say the character hit with a mace. Okay, and let's suppose for a second that that mace inflicts 8 LHP worth of damage. It strikes him in the head. Well, by default, the SV tells me that, yeah, 8 hit points can be deducted from the helmet itself, but iron's pretty strong, so it's got a lot more than that. But SV is going to muffle the damage in half when it goes to affect the wearer's body. So 8 suddenly becomes 4, right? So 4 would affect the tissue automatically because it's muffled. And then striking or bursting damage goes into the next level. So striking damage, in this case, we're being hit with a mace. The 4 already got hit by tissue, so the next one is halved, would be 2 to the skeleton. So in this case, the skull, right? So the skull takes 2 points of damage. Okay, so it's a pretty nasty fracture, and that was a very hard blow, by the way. So if we have that again, then guess what? We have 1 hit point of damage, which in most humanoid characters, especially in this example, humans have 1 hit point in their vital organs, in this case their brain. So that one hefty blow of 8 hit points, even though they were wearing an iron helmet, absolutely clobbered the wearer, and he is officially DEAD, dead. Now let's talk about actual armor material defaults. Now here is a list of some common armor materials that you'll see in not just Glyphs, but in many types of RPGs. Now you can add, move, modify however you see fit, just like everything here, but this just gives you an idea of the type of materials that we're going to look at from an AHP and SV standpoint and resilience standpoint. So here's the material name. At the top here, you'll see the different configurations. So light through reinforced and even fortified if you wanted to use that, which is, again, very extreme armor, but some people want to use that, that's fine. Okay, your Warcraft type armor, for instance. Okay, then you have an example of the configuration. So ringed and studded would be light, full would be banded or splint, and so forth. So that's what this top piece is here. Now in these little blue squares here are your AHP and R, or your resilience values here. So the weakest form of armor in the game by default is light fabric armor with an HP of 1 and an R of SM1. So not only does it have 1 HP of strength, but even a small weapon with an intensity 1 attack can damage that armor. So obviously the weakest type here. Okay, a common type that you'll see in a lot of role-playing games. Okay, let's look at iron. Iron Okay, let's look at light iron. So we don't want to restrict movement too much. Let's just say. So an AHP of 61 and a resilience of LG2. So nice set of AHP there. And to damage that section, a large weapon needs to strike with an intensity 2 attack. So this just gives you an idea of what this armor material default chart means. So check it out, and there's also a lot of the defaults here on your quick gen screen to save you time. Okay, page 97 on the armor chapter talks about armor pricing defaults. So very quick, there's two types of pricing we look at in Glyphs. So the here are your standard materials, okay? And as you can see here, we have different recommended strength levels. So anything from fabric to polymers, you want to have at least a 1 strength, okay? From silver to iron, you want to be at least a level 2, which is your average strength. And stone all the way through ceramic, you want to be at least a level 3 strength. So you can choose to enforce that or not, that's totally fine, but that's how we look at it here. Now, from purchasing armor, the red squares are your point buy values when you're creating a new character, okay? So fabric is 1, then you have ceramic all the way to the other extreme, fortified, you have 90. So each gambit as you're creating a new character has its set of values that you can use to purchase with, and we'll talk about that in the character creation chapter, okay? Next we have the in-game monetary values, so cheap all the way through exclusive. So what do I mean by that? So in-game, if you're willing to purchase or sell a certain type of armor section, this is how you would determine your monetary value. So cheap, let's look at hide armor, a medium hide armor. So cheap times 7. What do I mean by that? So in the currency chapter, you will learn how to come up with different values and get really good with currencies, but just spend the token and determine the number for cheap, okay, and then modify and then multiply that by 7, and that's basically your in-game value that you would sell or buy that hide piece for. So this just gives you an idea of pricing and point buy. Next we have a quick overview of shields, helmets, and guards. Okay, you got your configurations here, your light all the way through fortified, your different advantages, okay. Certain advantage score assigned to them, okay, just like weapons do because they're concerned with blocking. So just note that out. And also shields give you an extra bonus to your blocking attempt, okay. Helmets, they just have advantage scores of 1 all the way through 5. And finally we have guards. We have advantage scores of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then if you want to use them for parrying, then that metric is here too. You're not going to see that often, but it could happen. So there's some parry modifiers as well. In addition to the different material values and the configurations, armor can definitely be upgraded through different technological or magical means. These are just some examples that you can have. Okay, so page 99 and 100 gives you, a list of pretty common upgrade options here. So real quick, let's take a look at let's look at insulated as an example. So here you have the name, you have the recommended monetary value to get that upgrade. Okay, so insulated just means that it's well insulated against shock damage. So what that upgrade would do is gives you an additional SV ranking. So to get that upgrade, that's the value, and just scroll down here at your leisure for different ideas of upgrades. Okay, so page 100, same thing. And finally, we get to force fields. Okay, now force fields serve two purposes. Number one, they give an extra layer of protection aside from defenses and armor. Okay, or in some campaigns that can be the only armor you use. So if you're playing a sci-fi type campaign where they don't really use armor but they use energy weapons or whatever, you can use force fields. Or if you're one of those people that really wants a hit point driven type campaign and you want to reflect that, if you're one of those that just wants to whittle hit points down on your opponent, then this is another way that you could reflect that, is through force fields. So they can come in different forms. So magical jewelry, technological bracelets, or tiaras, or whatever type of object that emits a force field. Okay, so that's up to you to figure out. Now, in Glyphs, there are three types of main force fields. We have X from melee damage, X projectile, which protects you, or an enemy for that matter, against projectile attacks. So bullets, arrows, shurikens, anything ranged. And finally, X power simply protects the wearer from a magical or other special type of power attack. So that's the way we look at them here. Now, you can decide as the architect how much AHP it comes with, or you start your characters with. That's up to you. But just know here that if the character wants to upgrade their force field, then there are some default pricing recommendations here from like I said, let's look at the example here. So pricing for X melee, so every 3 HP additional force would be in the moderate value range, and so forth. So just keep that in mind if you want to use force fields. Certainly a nice alternative to offer besides the regular armor coverage. So that pretty much covers it for Chapter 5.